Never did so mocking a fantasy obsess the mind of mortal man. We shall strive to resist him by land and sea. We shall be on his track wherever he goes. He will find no peace, no rest, no halting place, no parley. It will not be by German hands that the structure of Europe will be rebuilt.
By early 1944, the world had been at war for 5 years. And during that time, we'd seen the Nazi empire expand massively. But then, by about 1942, the tide begins to turn. Hitler is now starting to be really squeezed. But what needs to happen still is a massive Allied invasion of Northern Europe, an invasion that needs to push its way all the way through to the heart of the Third Reich. And that, of course, is the Nazi capital, Berlin. Berlin has to fall.
Sie täuschen sich alle, die glauben, dass auch nur ein Riss in das Gefüge unserer einzigen Bewegung gekommen sei. Sie steht fest, so wie dieser Block hier.
In the early 20th century, Adolf Hitler's ability to rally support among his people was unparalleled, earning him a place as one of history's most formidable dictators.
On the 30th of January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, but of a coalition government. So there were just 3 Nazi posts in that coalition government.
It's very tempting to think that when Hitler comes to power in early 1933, that his grip on power is absolutely total. In fact, he has a very uneven, shaky start. He's still quite worried about public opinion. So what he does is a mixture of passing various laws that give him more and more power, like the Enabling Act, that actually makes him immensely powerful. But also, he takes advantage of various events like the Reichstag fire, in which the German Parliament building burns down. Now, it's highly likely, but never proven, whether the Nazis actually burnt it down themselves. But certainly, in a sense, it doesn't matter. What happens is that Hitler and the Nazis took advantage of the Reichstag burning down to show that there was a communist plot against what the Nazis described as still being a democratic government. And it enabled them to seize more power, by emergency decree.
Very quickly, he turned Germany into a one-party state. So first of all, he made sure to eliminate the influence and power of the German political left. So the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, for a start, were banned. But over a short amount of time as well, the Nazi Party was the only legal party too.
And eventually, in January 1933, he becomes Chancellor. Now, don't forget, Chancellor in Germany, and this still remains today, is not, at the time, the head of state. The head of state is the president. So it's the Chancellor, though, who has the real executive power. In order to take as much power as he can, he's also going to have to make himself head of state. And that really becomes an opportunity for him when Hindenburg dies, and he's able to take on the role of both president and chancellor and kind of create this new role for himself, and that is the role of Führer, the German word for leader. This has become a totalitarian state, and Hitler can say to the German people, you voted for it. It's a con, and it's a con that worked.
With a God complex drilled into his mind, Hitler saw himself as the only leader Germany ever needed. He used democracy to build popularity, but had every intention of destroying it. Hitler began by promoting his concept of the Aryan race, which he considered the pure master race of Germans. He advocated for strict reproductive laws, including the sterilization of individuals with hereditary traits he deemed undesirable and inconsistent with his Aryan ideal.
You have a lot of laws being passed, unsurprisingly, to give the Nazis more power. But also you've got a rise in the apparatus of state terror. You have a thing called the Gestapo, now completely notorious, but that stands for Secret State Police. This is a new police force. There's already the Kripo, the criminal police. But this is a new type of policeman. It's a policeman who is in plain clothes. It's a policeman who recruits informers, on every block, on every street, and every block of flats, in order for the people to effectively police themselves. And of course, this becomes an incredibly important part of the Nazi apparatus.
In October 1933, Hitler withdrew Germany from the League of Nations. His goal was to enforce his radical ideas and to begin rebuilding the German army.
He had the idea of a very aggressive and expansionist foreign policy, and essentially this idea of might over morality, so force over anything rational, I suppose, in a way, force in terms of foreign affairs. And of course, the League of Nations was designed to promote peace and to enhance security, of course, too. And so this was why Hitler wanted to remove Germany from it.
The German people had full support for Hitler, unaware of the horrors to unfold during his reign of terror. On the 1st September 1939, Hitler launched an attack on Poland, underestimating the start of World War II. For the first time, foreign leaders became aware of his insanity.
In September 1939, Hitler invades Poland, along with Stalin. Soviet Russia also invades Poland at the same time. But what the world remembers is the fact that Hitler invaded Poland, and a couple of days later, the British declare war on Germany.
The German population, because of Hitler's popularity, and even though they had experienced the horrors of the First World War and the trench warfare of the First World War and all of the shell shock and everything that went with it, because he was so popular, they might have been delighted to go to war in September 1939, but they went along with it.
Hitler divulged a concept called Blitzkrieg, a lightning war, to his German public. Hitler himself claimed it to be a war of racial annihilation. No mercy was to be upheld. Within just 6 weeks, Poland was crushed by the German army and tens of thousands of Poles executed. The 2 million Jews living in Poland now found themselves under German rule, their fate uncertain. Hitler's move launched Europe into turmoil, but Nazi Germany did not halt there.
Hitler is always mindful of public opinion. I think that it's always important to remember that Hitler, does always worry about what the German people think about him. He doesn't just sort of seize power in 1933 and then not care. He wants to be liked, he wants to be popular, he is a political leader after all, and all political leaders, democratic or fascist or otherwise, want to be liked. Now, the best way to make yourself liked is to project an image that the people can identify with or respect or admire. And what he does is he uses propaganda and photography and film to show him as this kind of almost sort of messianic figure.
In 1940, Hitler's all-powerful army ruled over Denmark, Norway, Holland and Belgium, and eventually crushes France. Germany became untouchable, and the war between the Axis powers and allies would be long and brutal.
Really, one of the high points of Hitler's popularity was the image of the Nazis taking over Paris. All of these attacks were very sort of quick and easy victories for the Nazis, and they just fed Hitler's success and popularity.
Had Hitler stopped after he'd successfully conquered France and the Low Countries and not decided in June 1941 that he was going to invade this really quite big country called Russia, he may have stayed in power. But in June 1941, he has this enormous roll of the dice. It's the ultimate gamble. I'm going to invade Russia. I'm going to get to Moscow before winter. And so he thinks he's going to be able to do it. He's built up his armed forces. You know, Stalin's had this pact with Hitler for years, and he's thinking Hitler's never going to invade. Oh dear. Hitler goes straight in, June 1941, and again, the Blitzkrieg, Operation Barbarossa, as it was called in this instance, was tremendously successful. And initially, the forces just went through Russia like a knife through butter. And they slaughtered, pillaged in their wake. This was an absolutely a dazzling piece of offensive warfare. But of course, what Stalin's got is a lot of room to fight in, because he can retreat and retreat and retreat and retreat, and you've still got thousands of miles of Russia behind you that you can fall back on. But also what Stalin does is he's very good at regrouping and getting his forces back together. Germans use a lot of over-designed tanks, over-designed uniforms, over-designed weapons. What the Russians are good at doing is just getting things together in a kind of makeshift way, but that works. You know, everything the Russians have, uniforms, tanks, weaponry, is all really simple, really easy to use, really easy to mass produce very, very quickly. German kit takes ages to produce. So this is another real problem that's faced by the Germans.
The aim was to conquer the Soviet Union before winter, but Stalin's Red Army had very different ideas. The fight would be long and bitter, and Hitler's decision to destroy his non-aggression pact with Stalin would cost him dearly. What's more, the alliances of the conflict changed overnight, and Churchill immediately contacted Stalin to secure the might of Russia to fight for the Allied cause.
Hello, NBC. Hello, NBC. This is KGU in Honolulu, Hawaii. I am speaking from the roof of the Advertiser Publishing Company building. We have witnessed this morning a distant view, a great battle off Pearl Harbor, and a severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese.
On the 7th December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, plunging the United States into World War II. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling the attack a date which will live in infamy and asking for a declaration of war against Japan.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Roosevelt's decision marked a turning point, as the US not only entered the Pacific conflict, but also found itself drawn into a global struggle against tyranny. Soon after, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, expanding the fight to two fronts, Europe and the Pacific. The entrance of the world's biggest superpower into the conflict would shake Hitler's Germany to the core, reshaping the course of the biggest war in history.
We have certainly a most encouraging example here of what can be achieved by British and Americans working together, heart and hand. But our thanksgivings, however fervent, must be brief. Heavier work lies ahead, not only in the European, but as I have indicated, in the Pacific and Indian spheres.
Over the next couple of years, Hitler's Germany faced mounting pressures on multiple fronts. By 1943, the tide of the war began to shift in favor of the Allied powers. After intense fighting in the heat, the Axis powers surrender in North Africa. Stalin's Red Army continues to slaughter German troops on the Eastern Front, retaining key cities such as Stalingrad and Kursk. On the 28th of November, Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt meet at the Tehran Conference in Iran. The Big Three know that an Allied invasion of France cannot wait. Hitler must be brought to his knees, once and for all.
1943 sees this really crucial conference at Tehran, the capital of Iran. And that's where Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin all meet each other in person for the first time. Now, Stalin is very impatient. He's saying to Roosevelt and Churchill, listen, I've been fighting Nazi Germany and have lost millions of men and women since 1941. And his attitude is slightly, what are you guys up to? When are you going to mount your big second front against the Nazis in Europe? Yeah, all right, well done in Africa, well done, in Italy, but that's not going to change things. What you've got to do is invade northern France and make your way through to Germany. And that is essentially what happens at Tehran. It's a lot of negotiation, power play between the three biggest Allied figures on the planet.
It will not be by German hand that the structure of Europe will be rebuilt.
By early 1944, the world had been at war for, 5 years? And during that time, we'd seen the Nazi empire expand massively, but then by about 1942, the tide begins to turn. Hitler is now starting to be really squeezed. But what needs to happen still is a massive Allied invasion of Northern Europe, an invasion that needs to push its way all the way through to the heart of the Third Reich, and that, of course, is the Nazi capital, Berlin. Berlin has to fall.
As the year 1944 dawned, the once unassailable power of the Führer began to waver. Within the echelons of the German High Command, loyalty waned, and doubts regarding Hitler's prowess as a military leader spread throughout the Third Reich like wildfire.
There were many senior figures in the German armed forces who were very, very privately negative about Hitler's military leadership. Hitler saw himself as a kind of tactical and strategic genius. And he would look at maps of his generals and he would tell them what's what. But the generals, they knew that some of the things he was asking them to do were just futile and hopeless. So there's a lot of negativity buzzing around the German High Command. The Allied commanders knew that Hitler was seriously overstretched. He was fighting this kind of life and death struggle on the Russian front. He had lost in North Africa, he was fighting in Italy. There was a lot for Hitler to contend with. And so what they knew is that Hitler was in a relatively weak position. If a new front was going to be started in France, then Hitler was going to really struggle.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. We will accept nothing less than full victory, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
On the 6th of June, 1944, the Allies opened a new front in Europe with a daring amphibious invasion on the beaches of Normandy, France. "156,000 Allied troops from America, Canada, and Britain took part in the invasion and bravely faced the hail of machine gun fire from German forces. Known as D-Day, this massive assault marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany as Allied forces began their march toward the liberation of Western Europe. In their ignorance, the top of the German command were nowhere to be seen.
One of the biggest problems that besets the Germans is inactivity at the very highest level. You have Rommel at his wife's birthday, and you have Adolf Hitler fast asleep. Hitler's one of these people who goes to bed very late and he gets up very late, and no one wakes him up. No one dares wake him up because they're not sure whether this is the big invasion or just some diversionary attack.
Disagreements further arose over the positioning of the Germans' key panzer divisions. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt advocated placing the panzer divisions further inland, away from the reach of Allied naval guns. However, Erwin Rommel opposed this strategy, arguing that Allied air superiority would render flanking attacks impossible, and insisted on positioning everything up front, including the panzers. He asserted that the invasion must be stopped within the first 24 hours, or not at all. Ultimately, the decision rested with the Führer.
Hitler was always arguing with his generals. He wanted the panzer divisions near Calais, Rommel wanted them somewhere else. You know, there were constant disagreements going on between Hitler and the high command. Had the generals had their way, then it's possible that D-Day would have been a lot tougher for the Allies than it actually was. So one of the biggest helpers that the Allies actually have during D-Day is Adolf Hitler himself, because he always gets it wrong. What Hitler decides to do is to split the difference. It's basically a terrible act of indecision. Rather than commit all those divisions to Normandy to repel the invasion, he holds many of them back near Paris, and that's going to really help the Allies.
On D-Day, commanders on the ground in Normandy pleaded with Hitler to release some panzer divisions and divert the standing army at Calais in order to slow the invasion inland.
It's only the insistence of his senior commanders that makes Hitler release these divisions. They're saying, look, we've just got to have them. There's no good them just sitting all the way back there. You've got to move them. And Hitler eventually relents.
The mistakes made by the German command opened the doors for the Allies.
After the Allies successfully land on D-Day and start using those beaches to, get tons and tons of men and material, into northern France, what now follows is the Battle of Normandy. And that is a very, very attritional, tough battle. And one of the reasons for that is because the Normandy countryside, the bocage as it's called, is sort of undulating, and it's got lots and lots of hedgerows you can hide behind. It is almost like urban warfare, but in the countryside. Lots of places to hide, lots of places for snipers, lots of ditches, lots of hedgerows, lots of woods, lots of copses. It's very, very difficult. And as a result, it becomes a very long and drawn out battle that's going to cost a lot of lives on both sides.
Canadian, British, and American units fought hard to take key cities and towns across the Normandy region. The battles were often bloody, exhausting, and could last for weeks at a time.
Normandy was littered with really tactically useful locations that the British had to capture. So Cherbourg, a major port even today, that has to be captured if you want to unload supplies, for the big effort. So, that's one place you've got to capture. Then you've got this big stronghold just a few miles inland called Caen. And Caen was really heavily bombed by the Allies in order to get rid of the Germans.
The fighting in Normandy continued for 2 more months after D-Day. 425,000 Allied and German troops were killed, wounded, or went missing during the battle. The Allied bombings also killed around 20,000 French citizens, many of which were in hiding from Nazi forces.
With 2 great amphibious landings, followed by one of the most powerful, most brilliantly executed military campaigns of history, the Allies round out their master plan for the liberation of France and the crushing of the German enemy in the West.
The liberation of Paris on the 25th of August, 1944, marked a pivotal moment in World War II. As Allied forces, led by the Americans and Free French, entered the French capital, the move dealt a crushing blow to Nazi morale and the heart of Hitler's empire. The fall of Paris not only disrupted German control over Western Europe, but also symbolized the beginning of the end for Nazi dominance.
The liberation of Paris is, of course, an absolutely symbolic moment for the Allied invasion. Hitler had ordered the Germans there to basically destroy the city, to flatten it, rather than let it fall into Allied hands. But the German garrison there realizes that as the Allies approach, they're not going to win, they're going to be encircled. What you might end up with is going to be a kind of siege, people are going to starve. And so, of course, when the Allies do go into Paris, the Free French forces go into Paris, and General de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, goes into Paris, this is a hugely symbolic moment. France had been humiliated by Hitler in 1940. Those images of Hitler posing near the Eiffel Tower, of course, represented utter capitulation. And so, for that swastika to come down off the Eiffel Tower and be replaced by the French tricolour was a hugely morale-boosting moment and really showed that D-Day and the tide of war were going the way of the Allies. Ultimately, Hitler is now being squeezed in a massive, massive continental vice. He's got Stalin from the east, he's got the Americans and the British and other allies from the west. That is just going to be absolutely unstoppable.
The Soviets now faced the critical task of pushing relentlessly through Eastern Europe, driving towards Berlin to deliver the final blow to Hitler's regime.
Once the Red Army came into German territory in 1945, then Hitler's position as this infallible ruler and leader really not only became to be called into question, but really came to its end, because the Soviet troops were very vengeful. They were retaliating for all the terrible brutalities and atrocities that the Nazis and the German army had put into place in Soviet territory. What it meant was that they were coming closer and closer on their journey westwards to Berlin, and eventually Hitler and a very small inner circle around him had to retreat to his bunker, his underground bunker.
This is a war brought about by Hitler, and this is a war that Hitler has fought for too long, and he's fighting it to the death, and he's fighting it to the death of the people who he supposedly loves, and he no longer loves them by the end of the war. And he says that basically the German people don't deserve him, the German people don't deserve Germany, and everybody should fight to the death because basically, they don't deserve to be alive because they failed him. Classic narcissistic thinking. The world is for him, and he's not there for the world.
By January 16th, 1945, Hitler fully retreated into the Führerbunker, taking residence with Eva Braun and his other closest allies. Inside the concrete sarcophagus, Hitler would spend over 100 days trapped, further adding to his paranoia and anxiety about the war. The shelter itself contained 18 small rooms and was located 55 feet underground, and Hitler would spend the majority of his time micromanaging over what was left of the German defenses. Hitler personally selected a few SS officers to join him, serving as his bodyguards and keeping him informed of events above. The propaganda minister, Josef Goebbels, also brought his family into the bunker, a last act of undying loyalty to the German leader. As the Red Army rapidly approached, Hitler and his associates, lacking clear intelligence on the front line, remained unaware of the severity of the situation. Life in the bunker was delusional, with everyone pretending Germany was winning the war, ignoring the grim reality of their crumbling empire above.
The first half of 1945 is probably the darkest 6 months in Germany's history because it's being invaded by the Russians, the Red Army from the east, and you've got the other allies coming through from the west. And it's the Russians who reach Berlin first. And when they reach Berlin, it's a city in rubble, it's a city in flames, it's a city in chaos, it's a city in which squads of marauding loyal Nazis are going around hanging people who are not taking part in the resistance to the city. It's a city in which you then got some Nazis committing suicide. It is the most benighted, appalling place you can imagine. And you've got the Soviet army literally raping and pillaging this city.
The Allied leaders met to decide a fate for post-war Germany, whilst the battle for Berlin was beginning. The Russians moved steadily from the east, whilst the Western Allies crossed the Rhineland, and by April, the Soviet troops, 3 million strong, dealt brutal blows to the last traces to the German resistance. When Hitler learned of Mussolini's death on the 28th of April, 1945, he was deeply disturbed. The news of his former ally's execution by Italian partisans, followed by the public display of Mussolini's mutilated body, struck a chilling blow to Hitler's already fragile psyche, reinforcing his growing fear of capture and humiliation. The Führer began making plans for his own death, determined to avoid the fate that had befallen Mussolini.
Hitler's last days in the Führer bunker under the Reich Chancellery in the centre of Berlin, are a kind of terrible end of a Shakespearean tragedy, as the thunder of Russian artillery all around them, and they're deep inside this sort of concrete underground fortress. Everybody's sort of kind of going mad. And especially Hitler, who then gets married to his long-term girlfriend, Eva Braun, in this sort of kind of bizarre ceremony. And then just a few days later, Hitler, on the 30th of April, 1945, decides to take his own life, and Eva Braun is going to do the same thing with him, or Eva Hitler, as of course she became. And so he goes into his little kind of living room with his new bride, and they poison and shoot themselves. It's thought that Hitler's done both. He takes a little glass ampoule, a little canister of cyanide, and also shoots himself. And Eva Braun commits suicide by poisoning herself. Their bodies are then removed by some loyal SS men, his adjutant, and they are taken out in what passes now for a garden in the right chancellery, but of course it's just a kind of pockmarked hellhole of artillery shells. And there they are, their bodies are burnt in this great kind of almost like a sort of Viking pyre, like a Viking longship going up.
By the time of his death, public support for Hitler had collapsed. Few Germans mourned his passing. Most were too busy trying to survive or fleeing from the fight. The city at the heart of his 1,000-year Reich burnt to the ground and crumbled in ruins.
Very little of Hitler remains. There is a bit of jawbone in an archive in Moscow, the teeth of which absolutely match Hitler's dental records. So there's no doubt that Hitler died. A lot of people like to say that Hitler escaped after the war. It's total nonsense. Hitler 100% died in Berlin on the 30th of April 1945. And with it, so did Nazism, or at least it did for a while.
World War II in Europe officially ended on the 8th of May, 1945, with the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. Known as VE Day, the surrender marked the culmination of intense Allied offensives from both the West and East, as well as the fall of Berlin to Soviet forces. With Germany's collapse, the war in Europe was finally over. This victory brought an end to 6 years of brutal conflict, which cost millions of lives. Celebrations and parades broke out all across Europe. Relief filled the atmosphere as people welcomed home their sons, brothers, and fathers for good.
Germany, the enemy who drove all Europe into war, has been finally overcome. But at this hour, when the dreadful shadow of war has passed far from our hearths and homes in these islands, we may at last make one pause for Thanksgiving and then turn our thoughts to the tasks all over the world which peace in Europe brings with it.
This is a solemn but glorious hour. I wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to see this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe. For this victory, we join in offering our thanks to the Providence which has guided and sustained us through the dark days of adversity and into light.
Victory in Europe brought wild rejoicing throughout the Allied world as the Big Three announced the downfall of Nazi Germany. New York's celebration is typical of the nation's joy at the end of nearly 6 years of war in Europe. It's a great day as a thankful people let loose their pent-up emotions.
The tyrannical force of Nazi Germany sent the world into chaos, fighting to defeat this growing empire of hate, violence, and discrimination. Hitler's war has left a mark on history, a reminder that this behavior should never be tolerated, and the world should not dismiss such brutal atrocities again.
It was very difficult for the German population to come to terms with what they found out about the Hitler regime after its demise. The Allied occupation from 1945 brought about the demilitarization, the denazification, and the re-education of Germans, and that was very important.
The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury,
stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason.
There were also the Nuremberg trials and a host of other post-war trials in which the leading Nazis, at least the ones who hadn't committed suicide, the leading Nazis were brought to trial. Again, this kind of brought to popular attention exactly what the evils of the regime had been. For successive generations of Germans, they've really struggled to come to terms with this very difficult aspect of their nation's past.
It's hard to say that there's a specific moment when we know that Germany got over the evil of Hitler's regime. There was no doubt that for many years, decades, a process of learning about your past has taken place in Germany. Of course, school children are taught today in Germany what was done in the name of the German people. I mean, there are two ways of looking at it. You can either say the Germans were seized by this bunch of gangsters and then they abused the power that was given to them, or the Germans willingly gave these people this power.
Today, in the waning weeks of the European war, the world sees proof of acts of savagery unparalleled in history. The Supreme Allied Commander himself views the Nazi murder mills with his generals. Fearing that word of these nameless horrors might not be believed at home, he summons lawmakers and editors to see for themselves, then report to America. At this fiendish gallows, men died in drawn-out agony. In the new light of this camera record, the last war's atrocity stories, once thought propaganda, gain new credence.
For successive generations of Germans, they've really struggled to come to terms with this very difficult aspect of their nation's past.
Yes, some rumours did circulate back from soldiers on leave, and other information did filter back to the Reich, but the German population was busy with facing its own war, dealing on a day-to-day basis with the course of the war, Allied bombings, rationing, food shortages.
It's hard to say that there's a specific moment when we know that Germany got over the evil of Hitler's regime. There was no doubt that for many years, decades, a process of learning about your past has taken place in Germany. Of course, school children are taught today in Germany what was done in the name of the German people. I mean, there are two ways of looking at it. You can either say the Germans were seized by this bunch of gangsters and then they abused the power that was given to them, or the Germans willingly gave these people this power. Certainly, there are a lot of reasons why you might have voted for Hitler in the 30s, not all of which involved you being evil. But certainly, if you were a fan of Hitler after the war still, and after all the revelations that had come out, then I would say you definitely are evil.